Right, so on this channel, I recommend cheaper group sets from AliExpress all the time. I've been running them exclusively for years and years on all my bikes at this point. But if I'm honest, out of the box, they're rarely as good as their Shimano equivalents. But with a few tweaks, group sets like this R9 disc from L-TWOO, which is just 108 quid on AliExpress at the moment, they can come incredibly close to Shimano levels of performance. So today I'm going to share all my tips and tricks for getting the most out of this and loads of the other cheaper group sets out there. My name, as always, is Luke, and welcome back to Tracefellow, aka a garage in the southeast of England. Okay, let's jump straight in with shifting, mechanical shifting specifically, because if you're using these group sets, chances are you're on a budget and that's what you're going to be dealing with. Electronic shifting, even the kind of cheaper alternatives coming out of China like the L-TWOO ERX, they're still 400-500 quid for a group set. In my opinion, that's still a pretty premium option for most riders, I think. With mechanical shifting, the benefit with decent Shimano or SRAM gear is that the feedback you get through the shift lever as you click through the gears is very pronounced. It feels deliberate. I get the feeling that the return springs on the derailleurs and the internal mechanism inside the shifters are just very well tuned to provide this to you. The cheaper group sets from AliExpress, they're not quite there. I feel like the tolerances aren't as tight and maybe the return springs aren't tuned as well. The shifts can feel a little vague or mushy compared to, decent Shimano gear. That's why reducing friction on the cable run to the derailleurs is absolutely crucial. So first tip, and this is a genuine game changer, whenever you can, run the gear cable housing unbroken from the shifter all the way to the derailleurs. If you use external cabling on your frame, like my steel road bike here, that's going to be tricky. But if your frame uses cable stops, try and bypass them. On this frame, I drilled them out both sides. It's originally designed so that just the bare cables run through the frame and then underneath the bottom bracket via this plastic cable guide here. I find it can create a lot of friction on the cables at this point, especially if you ride in wet or muddy conditions. It can degrade the shifting quite quickly in my experience. So right now on this bike, I run full cable housings to the derailleurs and they're routed over the top of the bottom bracket inside the frame. Funnily enough, I used to think that a long continuous run of cable housing might actually increase friction, because if you think about it, a bare cable running through the frame only kind of touches at this point underneath the bottom bracket, whereas a full length of cable housing, the cable is kind of in contact the whole way down. But in reality, it's the complete opposite. It massively reduces friction and just makes the shifting buttery smooth. The first time I did it, it genuinely felt like a completely different group set. Plus, as a bonus, full-length cable housing provides great weatherproofing, so the cable's protected from water, rust, oxidation, corrosion. Genuinely, if you do one thing with these cheaper group sets, do this. Now, one other option, if you can't or you don't want to bypass the frame stops on your frame, you can do what my friend Ollie has done here with his Giant. And you can use these separate cable liners. I've tried this stuff a couple of times. I honestly prefer a full length of housing, but if that's not possible, this does do basically the same thing. So you've got your gear cable running through the frame and under the bottom bracket via that plastic guide plate. You essentially take some of this cable liner and run it over the top of the cable so it covers the cable in this particular region, therefore reducing friction on this curve here underneath the frame, and it does improve shifting. I think this particular cable liner is from Jaguar, and you can see that green stuff. That's actually lube pre-applied inside to help reduce friction. So yeah, this is definitely an option if running full housings is a problem for you. Now, running in the same vein, I've got 3 other tips. Not crucial, but if you can, use 1.1 rather than 1.2 millimeter diameter shift cables. 1.1 is the SRAM standard, I think, whereas 1.2 is Shimano. A slimmer cable is technically a little bit weaker, but 1.1 millimeter cables are almost always compatible and they're more flexible, so just offer less friction and slightly better shifting as a result. Grease your shift cables as you install them. I've tried all sorts over the years. 3-in-1 oil, WD-40, GT85, multi-purpose grease, but they all pale in comparison to this stuff right here. Official Shimano cable grease. A tub this size is probably going to cost you 20 quid on eBay, something like that. And if you replace your cables once a year, this thing is gonna last you forever. So yeah, well worth it in my opinion. Lastly, this might sound a bit stupid, but use a large loop of cable housing out the back to the rear derailleur. On the Sensah and L-TWOO group sets I've used over the years, I've tried to make this as small as possible, mainly for aesthetic reasons, but I found it can affect shifting. I find a larger loop out the back is better for two reasons. Number one, a more gradual curve out the back is gonna reduce friction on that cable run. And two, the rear derailleurs on these cheaper group sets, they tend to use a slightly older, more dated design with a standard hanger bolt. For example, they don't use the B-link that Shimano's been using on their rear derailleurs for a number of years. So they do require a loop out the back, but I find a slightly larger loop than strictly necessary tends to make for slightly better shifting. As we're on the rear derailleur, the B tension screw. Now, when I ran full Shimano gear, I don't think I ever touched this, to be honest with you, but I find with the cheaper stuff, it can make a huge difference to shifting performance. Now, it basically controls how close the upper jockey wheel on the derailleur runs to the teeth on the cassette. I tend to set mine running as close as possible without grinding. Now, with Shimano group sets, this gap here needs to be about 5 or 6 millimeters, although if it's larger, you can generally get away with it absolutely fine. I find these cheaper group sets are far more sensitive in this regard. So as mentioned, I run the upper jockey wheel as close to the cassette as I can without it grinding. I find any further away and the shifting gets sloppy and inconsistent pretty quickly. Now, it's a similar sort of story with wear on chains and cassettes. You've got to stay on top of it. I find the cheaper group sets are a little more sensitive in this regard, especially if you're using cheaper third-party cassettes like I tend to do. In essence, I find that full SRAM or Shimano setups with like a Shimano chain and a Hyperglide cassette, they're more forgiving if you catch my drift. So for example, if your cassette is a little bit worn or maybe you've got some grime on the shift cables, the well-tuned return springs and the tooth profiling and ramping on those Hyperglide cassettes, it just ensures consistent shifting even when conditions are maybe suboptimal. With these more budget group sets and cheaper third-party cassettes, the same sort of conditions might end up with something like this. But that said, keep things clean, reduce friction on the cable run as much as possible, and stay on top of worn parts. Your shifting should be top tier. So by now, shifting should be spot on, and the clicks when changing gear should feel much crisper. But a very common issue with cheaper shifters, they rattle. Even if the shifting is perfect, a rattling shifter just feels cheap. Shimano and SRAM gear is generally a bit nicer in this regard. They tend to have little rubber bumpers on the shift levers to stop things rattling, but these are nice to have. They're not strictly required for functionality, so they generally aren't included on these cheaper options, so I add my own. Both this L-TWOO group set and this Sensah one rattled actually after install, but a bit of adhesive bar tape behind the brake lever solved that problem in both cases. In addition, on this L-TWOO group set here, there is actually a little rubber bumper behind the shift lever, but on the older generations, this wasn't included, so I've put a little bit of tape here in the past to stop things rattling. Now, lastly, and this only applies to hydraulic group sets, but bleeding the brakes can be a little bit trickier than maybe you're used to. So L-TWOO and Sensah group sets always use mineral oil, not DOT fluid like SRAM. And in general, the process for bleeding the brakes is basically the same as Shimano gear, but there are a few caveats. Firstly, the thread sizing and the location of the bleed ports on the shifters and calipers isn't always the same with these cheaper group sets. For example, if you have an official Shimano bleed kit, I don't know if the threads on the bleed funnel will exactly match the ones that L-TWOO use on their shifter, and on the Sensah group set, the bleed port on the shifter is recessed quite far, and it's also at a bit of a funny angle. So my advice, get one of the universal bleed kits with loads of different adapters. I've used this one from Easy MTB for years. I picked this up on Amazon. I think it goes for like 10 quid. At the moment, it's got a bleed funnel, 2 syringes, some extra hoses, and loads of different adapters with different threading. Basically, I've yet to find a group set I can't bleed with this. Now, another quirk, on cheap group sets, the calipers don't have proper bleed nipples. They just have a threaded port. So basically, once you've bled the system, you can't just kind of twist a bleed nipple to seal everything off. So when it comes to removing the syringe you've got attached to the caliper, you've got to be quick getting that bolt back in place to avoid letting oil drain out and air back in the system. It can help to elevate the caliper at this point, but honestly, I don't really have a set technique for bleeding these cheaper group sets. Sometimes I'll use a bleed funnel, sometimes I'll use 2 separate syringes, one at either end of the system. Just be aware that with these cheaper group sets, while the process is broadly the same as bleeding a Shimano group set, you might need a slightly different technique or some different adapters. In fact, on some of the calipers I've dealt with, the bleed port is recessed quite far, so you can see on this plastic adapter here, I've had to shave it down to make it fit. So yeah, just get one of those universal bleed kits. They're cheap and they basically cover every eventuality. Now, one more thing with these L-TWOO group sets that's probably worth explaining because it does affect the bleeding technique. This grub screw on the front of the brake lever here, I think a lot of people assume it's a reach adjustment screw, but it doesn't actually change where the brake lever sits. I think it's technically a free stroke adjustment. So when you screw it in, it directly interfaces with the piston or the master cylinder in here and makes the brake pads touch the disc sooner on the lever throw. When you bleed these things, make sure this is unscrewed all the way because it can block the passage of oil through the brake setup and make bleeding almost impossible. One last thing regarding front derailleurs, on the newer L-TWOO group sets, there is actually a tension adjustment screw built into the front derailleur. On Sensah stuff, this doesn't exist, so you will need to put an inline barrel adjuster on the cable run to the front derailleur. Anyway, those are all my kind of tips and tricks. Like I said, out of the box, Shimano and SRAM gear is generally a bit better, but with a few tweaks, these cheaper group sets from L-TWOO and Sensah, they can get incredibly close to that top tier performance, trust me. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Like, subscribe, all that juicy goodness, and I'm gonna go get something to eat. Right, see you next time. Ciao.
It's the bonus clip time.
So I was intending to keep this a bit more sort of under wraps until I'd done a bit more testing, but this thing is so cool. I've got to give you a quick sneak peek. So this is my bike here, and forgive the kind of mud and grime all over it. I have been riding it a lot over the last few weeks, but let me spin it round. So there we go, all kind of spun round, and at first glance might look pretty normal, but have a look at these disc rotors. These are something pretty special. So these are fully legitimate carbon ceramic disc rotors, which is just nuts. So to be clear, they are not just kind of a carbon mixed with a bit of high temp resin and a few ceramic particles. The material and the composition of the disc is actually very similar to ones used in motorsport that you might be familiar with. So these deal with high temp incredibly well. I saw these guys at Eurobike earlier in the year. I put my name down and I've been chasing them to try and get hold of a set, and I finally got some. Now, I won't go into kind of too much detail here and I'll save it for the review, but to answer a question that I assume a lot of you have, the bite from cold is actually decent. So you don't need to build heat into the rotor or the pads in order to get some decent braking performance. Although once they are slightly warm, the performance does build and remains super consistent, even when you're kind of dragging them as much as possible down a descent like I've been doing, trying to put these through their paces. They're just a completely different beast to regular steel rotors. For example, the bedding in process, less about depositing pad material onto the disc and more about kind of polishing them. They've got a proprietary compound that they give you for the brake pads. There's just so many interesting aspects to talk about with these things. I mean, for example, I've been riding these for nearly 2 weeks and I still don't think the rear disc is fully bedded in yet. But that's just kind of another intricacy with these things that I'm going to go over. So yeah, stay tuned. That's going to be a really interesting episode because they're just so cool. Such a wicked bit of tech. Anyway, enough of that. I'm going to go and have some breakfast. I'll see you next time. Right, ciao.